Good morning, welcome to Headline Focus here live on Core Politics with me, Rob Double. It is Friday the 7th of July 2018. Let's have a look at what's making the political headlines today. And to start off with, this is the big crunch moment for the Prime Minister, Theresa May. It is the big Chequers meeting on Brexit with the whole Cabinet, in which she'll be going through and debating and discussing the Brexit position of the UK government in the Brexit negotiations in its entirety. And that is hoping, the Prime Minister rather is hoping, that by the end of today she'll be able to have a concrete government position which she can then take forward into the negotiations with the support of all of her cabinet ministers. Now, there's very much indications that whilst in previous discussions, previous stalemates between ministers and the Prime Minister over Brexit, there's been basically a fudge in order to kick the disagreement down the road until the last minute. There's no deadline now in terms of needing to resolve these issues. This is the brick wall in terms of actually coming up with a concrete set of proposals. And indeed, reports indicate today that the Prime Minister isn't interested in any more fudges, any more ambiguity. She's interested in a detailed position from the UK government, which is agreed upon by cabinet ministers. The devil's obviously in the detail, and that's what's hoping to be covered today. So let's have a look at what roughly the Brexit agreement is, or rather the Brexit position the Prime Minister is putting forward is. Now, this is slightly unconfirmed. It's from reports from the UK press. We don't know yet because it hasn't been published, hasn't been released by the government, but certainly it gives us an idea of potentially what is coming down the track. Now, the main thing is alignment on goods with the EU. The government will effectively say that they're going to align with the EU regulations in terms of goods, and that will maintain business and the movement of products really as much of a status quo as possible and minimal disruption to businesses. But it will also be phrased in a way that we are deciding as the UK to take control of our regulations, but we're also deciding to align ourselves with EU regulations and therefore follow EU regulations, knowing that we can withdraw from aligning at any time. So the element of control is still there, or at least that's how it's expected to be spun. One of the interesting negotiation pieces for the EU, however, is if they require, or rather demand, automatic renewal of UK regulations to ensure they align with any new EU regulations that come down the road. That might be a clincher in terms of the whole idea of where the control is over regulations, whether the UK still has sovereignty or whether they literally are just a rule taker from the EU. But that's certainly something that's come down. Like in terms of goods, the UK is staying very much reliant, or rather aligned with the EU. Now, the idea of this customs arrangement is now shifted to what's called a facilitated customs arrangement, and the idea is that goods are going to be charged at a UK tariff rate. The UK is going to have its own tariffs. That's important because it means that the UK, through setting its own tariffs, is able to negotiate its own trade deals with other countries. More on that in a second. But the goods that arrive, particularly from Northern Ireland and the Irish border, will be tracked, and they'll be tracked in their entirety. And if they're going from the UK into the continent, they'll be charged the EU tariff to ensure that it is compliant with the EU Customs Union as well. Now, that again is a mixture between Max Fac and the customs arrangement option that Prime Minister put forward. But basically, it's taking a bit of both, a bit of technology in there as well. That's very, very complicated, but that is the top line of it. No doubt more details when it comes through. One of the key things you'll see in today's papers in the headlines is the idea that the UK has basically written off a US trade agreement. Now, this is in most of the papers, at least, and a lot of them on the front pages. But the idea is that because the EU is aligning with the UK is aligning with the EU on goods regulations, i.e. products, it means that it's going to be very difficult to make further trade negotiations with other countries, particularly with the US, because the US has a very different regulatory regime regarding to goods compared to the EU. So in other words, if the UK wants to make an agreement with the US on goods, it will have to decide basically to disalign or move alignment from the EU to the US in order to comply with the US's trading on goods, because no doubt the US would demand some kind of alignment on goods in order to ensure a trade deal works. But in the current status quo, as the government seems to be saying that they're going to align with the EU, it basically means and rules out the idea of a UK-US trade deal. And that's very significant because in terms of President Trump, who's coming to the UK next week, and also in terms of the rhetoric of a global Britain, the US was always seen as the kind of hub of where to go, where the UK can go to really get the benefits of Brexit. That's unconfirmed, but certainly the reports today suggest that that is very much the case. Freedom of movement still is very much up in the air as well, whether in order to get preferential access to the internal market of the EU, the government will be able to be more relaxed about the idea of freedom of movement. That is still very much a grey area as well. A lot to be decided on, a lot to be actually brought into the public domain. So definitely today, probably in the later hours of today in the evening, will be the time to look out for. Next up, on a slightly lighter story, you mentioned President Trump is coming to the UK. He will be met by a President Trump giant baby balloon, which will be in Parliament Square. That's according to reports this morning. A giant inflatable figure depicting Donald Trump as a baby will be hovering over London whilst President Trump is due to meet Theresa May at 10 Downing Street on the 13th of July. Now, the campaigners who are behind this have raised almost £18,000 for this helium-filled figure. It's about 6 metres high, so it's actually pretty massive. And London Mayor Sadiq Khan has given permission now for the balloon to fly and to use Parliament Square Garden as a grounding point to basically hover. Now, it's only being allowed to fly for 2 hours on the morning of Friday the 13th, so there is an element of maybe President Trump will not actually be seeing it because he will not be around that area in those 2 hours that it's going to be up. Certainly he'll probably hear about it though, and the reaction is going to be very interesting there. Just a few caveats though, it hasn't been absolutely confirmed yet. It needs permission from the National Air Traffic Service because the project constitutes what's known as a non-standard flight in controlled airspace. But also it needs approval from the Metropolitan Police as well. So it's not absolutely confirmed, but certainly something which has got early approval from the Mayor of London, and something which perhaps for some will be a little bit provocative in the context of the post-Brexit diplomatic relations with the US and the previous volatility of the current president in terms of criticism or indeed ridicule. Final one more story comes from the EU side. Now, the EU are starting to show some cracks over Brexit, and this is mainly to do with what's going on in Germany, specifically to do with the Interior Minister under Angela Merkel, the Chancellor's government. Now, the FT has got, and they're leading with this on their front page, a leaked letter from Angela Merkel's Interior Minister. He's a guy called Horst Seehofer, and this is a letter he sent to the European Commission attacking them for playing hardball with Britain on a post-Brexit security relationship in particular. The quotes are that ensuring the security of citizens in Europe should take precedence over all other aspects of exit negotiations. Weakening the European security architecture would affect all EU citizens and undermine their fundamental need for security. The ever-present threat of cross-border terrorism shows the need for unlimited cooperation in future. Now, this is in the context of Michel Barnier, the EU's chief negotiator in the Brexit negotiations, ruling out continual full access for the UK for EU databases, which are used for security policing and stuff like that, and also less access of the control of border control for the UK if the UK maintains red lines in the current Brexit negotiations. His position reportedly strongly supported by France. There is no suggestion that Angela Merkel agrees with him in terms of what he's said to the European Commission. But what we're seeing here is, as the clarity and as the deadline approaches Brexit, perhaps that we're going to see more divisions from the EU27 or individual states or individual leaders within the EU27, perhaps more so than we have had in reports up until this point, where the EU has at least been considered relatively unified. But something definitely to look out for. First ripples perhaps coming from the continent. That's pretty much it for today, and indeed this week. You're up to date. Don't forget you can find all the latest on what we're doing here on Core Politics on our Facebook page and Twitter right here. But from me and all the team here at Core London, have a fantastic start to your Friday. See you again on Monday, around about 9 o'clock.